Hello and welcome to The Top Story, a podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Tianlu. Coming up in this edition. Clashes between protesters and law enforcement officers over immigration raids are continuing in Los Angeles. Austria is observing 3 days of national mourning following a school shooting in Graz. And the Russian Defense Ministry says the country's air defense systems have intercepted and destroyed over 100 Ukrainian drones. We begin in the United States. Clashes between protesters and law enforcement officers over immigration raids are continuing in Los Angeles. Mayor Karen Bass has declared a curfew in the downtown area. U.S. President Donald Trump has vowed to, quote, to liberate Los Angeles. He has deployed over 4,000 National Guards and 700 Marines to suppress the protests, which began on Friday. Hendrik Sebrandi has more from Los Angeles.
A series of speakers have taken the stage here to talk about their unhappiness, their anger at what's happened here in Southern California over the past 5 days or so. Of course, there have been, as we've been reporting, a number of detentions, immigration detentions and arrests. Also, of course, a major deployment of federal forces here, both National Guard as well as Marines. A couple of Los Angeles residents spoke about their feelings about this entire situation, the Trump administration's actions, and what they believe is a total overreaction to the immigration problem.
I'm not okay with this. I'm not okay with people getting taken from their jobs and being taken from when they're going into the federal building for their appointments. To do this the right way. And Trump doesn't seem to care. And it's not right. I'm not even like a Democrat or a Republican. I identify myself as an independent, but I can't see how this is right.
I really believe that it just seems overblown. I feel like, it's indicative of the irresponsibility of the current administration and the hatred and the xenophobia that they have for immigrants.
So you get the feeling there that people are quite unhappy. I feel this is just a heartless series of actions. And that hearing is set for this coming Thursday. The governor of California, who's a Democrat, Gavin Newsom, has demanded that the federal forces be withdrawn from L.A. Basically, he says they're not necessary here. The protests that happened since Friday did not rise to the level of needing either National Guard troops or Marines. A total of 2,100 National Guard troops are on the ground here right now, along with 700 Marines who are deployed here. For his part, President Trump addressed soldiers at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Here's what President Trump had to say, as well as what the governor here had to say in response.
We've deployed thousands of National Guard troops and hundreds of Marines to protect federal law enforcement from the attacks of a vicious and violent mob. And some of the radical left, they say, oh, that's not nice. Well, if we didn't do it, there wouldn't be a Los Angeles. It'd be burning today, just like their houses were burning a number of months ago.
We honor their service. We honor their bravery. But we do not want our streets militarized by our own armed forces. Not in L.A., not in California, not anywhere. We're seeing unmarked cars in school parking lots, kids afraid of attending their own graduation. Trump is pulling a military dragnet all across Los Angeles, well beyond his stated intent to just go after violent and serious criminals. His agents are arresting dishwashers, gardeners, day laborers, and seamstresses. That's just weakness masquerading as strength.
Governor Newsom, probably among the most outspoken of the Democrats who's reacted to the Trump administration's actions. Of course, a lot of people feel that California has been targeted because it is a state that leans Democratic. Trump, for his part, has been quite clear that he is very unhappy with lots of the things that have happened here in California. And this is yet one more example about the tension between the governor and the Democratic politicians in this state and the Trump administration right now. There were protests in some 24 cities in the United States, and there were more immigration arrests in cities like Omaha, Nebraska. Nebraska is a Republican-leaning state, but Omaha is a Democratic city, the largest city in Nebraska. Just an example of the fact that these immigration actions and these arrests are happening not just in California, but across the U.S. right now.
That was Hendrik Sibrandi reporting. Meanwhile, protests over immigration raids are spreading into many other cities in the US, with thousands of demonstrators voicing opposition to the government's deportation efforts. Mark New has more.
From Austin to Houston to Dallas, hundreds of protesters have taken to the streets in Texas for largely peaceful demonstrations, but not without confrontation. Police have arrested more than a dozen people in the state during protests of the U.S. government's mass deportation efforts. In New York, hundreds voiced their opposition. Police arrested more than 24 people at a sit-in protest at Trump Tower.
This country is building of immigration. Yeah. So it's not fair what happened. They avoid our civil rights. Now we have to speak up.
In Boston, protesters gathered to show support for workers who they say are part of the fabric of their community.
Trump and his ICE regime have been tearing families apart and wreaking havoc across the country, including our own neighborhoods, like Milton, like Everett and Chelsea, like what happened in Worcester, like my own neighborhood, Woburn, where my next-door neighbor was torn from her home and is still in detention.
People are also protesting ICE's arrest last week of California Services Employee International Union President David Huerta, who was released on bond on Monday. His detainment has fueled outrage in the San Francisco Bay Area.
And there will be a time when David Huerta is not the only labor leader. History tells us that if we're complacent, we will be complicit. We have to stand up to ICE. We have to stand up to this federal overreach.
Police in San Francisco have arrested about 155 people, including 6 children, as demonstrations spread from coast to coast.
That was Mark New reporting. In Europe, Austria is observing 3 days of national mourning following a school shooting in Graz. The incident left 11 people dead, including the shooter. 11 others were seriously injured. Police say the 21-year-old attacker used to be a student at the school. Media reports call the attack one of the most serious shootings in the country's history. The shooter's motive is unknown. Johannes Plischberger has more from the site.
We've now heard that the suspected shooter left a farewell letter at home before coming to this Austrian high school and before he shot multiple teenagers and a teacher. So speculation is that he must have planned not only the shooting but also his suicide, because after shooting all those people, he committed suicide in one of the bathrooms where police found him. All the children that have been evacuated from this high school, they've been brought to their families and some to hospitals where at least 2 are still fighting for their lives and are in life-threatening conditions, so the death toll could further rise. We know that the gunman, the shooter, he brought a Glock pistol and a shotgun to the school, where he entered 2 classrooms and shot at multiple students. He used to attend the school but did not graduate. Earlier I spoke with the mother of one of the survivors, and this surviving girl had to witness this terrible act of violence.
She said that was a lot of screaming and shooting, and then when they were running out from the classroom, unfortunately she saw one body on the floor, got shooted on her head, and that was one of her friends.
This is the worst mass shooting in Austria's post-war history. Austria is a very peaceful European country, ranking among the most peaceful nations in the world. So it's terrible news in this country, and this city here, the city of Graz, is deeply shocked. Christian Stocker, the Austrian Chancellor, he called it a national tragedy. He said this is a very dark day in the Austrian history. We've also heard reactions, condolences from other heads of government across Europe, from the EU Commission. The motive of the attacker is still not clear. We know that, according to reports, he has been bullied by ex-classmates, by former classmates, and he went to the school to actually enter one of the very classrooms he used to attend. He legally was bearing these 2 firearms. Austria actually is one of the most heavily armed countries in Europe. 30 people per 100 inhabitants are bearing arms. So far, politicians have not called for any actions, any changes in legislation. But the question arises, why was he bearing 2 firearms, and why was nobody noticing his behavior before?
That was Johannes Plischberger reporting. Turning to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The Russian Defense Ministry says the country's air defense systems have intercepted and destroyed over 100 Ukrainian drones. It targeted a facility of the Ukrainian military-industrial complex in Kyiv. The two sides have completed the second group of major prisoner exchange after they reached an agreement in Istanbul. The European Union has proposed 18 sanction packages targeting Russia's energy, banks and military sectors. The proposal includes a full transaction ban on 22 additional Russian banks. Dasha Chinshova has more from Moscow.
The Russian Ministry of Defense has confirmed that indeed they have targeted the facilities of the Ukrainian military-industrial complex in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. They say they carried out the group strike using long-range, high-precision weapons. They say they are not targeting civilian infrastructure of the country. Instead, they say they have carried out attacks against several defense-related targets, including aircraft, missile, armor, and shipbuilding industrial facilities in Kyiv, as well as command centers, troop deployment sites, weapons storage facilities. All those designated targets have been successfully hit. Now, for days now, we've been hearing the Russian MOD framing its attacks against the Ukrainian targets as the retaliation against Ukrainian acts of terrorism committed on the Russian soil, including those railroad attacks carried out by Kyiv against the passenger trains in Russia's Bryansk and Kursk regions. We're also hearing the Russian officials that they are now conducting the second part of the swap in the largest expected prisoner exchange. The second group of soldiers under the age of 25 has been swapped with the Ukrainians, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense. We don't know the exact number, but that has been taking place over the course of the past 2 days. And we're also hearing the Russian officials all saying that they still don't have any clarity with regard to the possibility of the repatriation of the dead Ukrainian soldiers. Moscow says it is ready to fulfill this arrangement that has been agreed upon back in the negotiations last week in Istanbul, and the Russian trucks carrying the 6,000 bodies of those dead Ukrainian soldiers are ready to transfer them to the Ukrainian side, but they have not received any clarity from the Ukrainian side on that. And also the Russian officials are now stressing very strongly that the terms of the peace deal that were negotiated back in 2022 were much softer than those that are being discussed now in 2025, as this conflict has been dragging for 3 years. And we also know that Russia is making gains in the Ukrainian Dnipropetrovsk region, which Kremlin says is part of the creation of the so-called buffer zone.
That was Dasha Chinishova reporting. Ukraine says it's premature to discuss preparations for a third round of talks with Russia. It comes after Kyiv claimed that Russia sent about 300 drones into Ukraine on Monday in one of the largest drone attacks in 3 years. The strikes damaged St. Sophia's Cathedral in the historic center of Kyiv, a designated World Heritage Site. Audrey McAlpine with the Associated Press has more from Kyiv.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky posting on X that it was one of the largest attacks on Kyiv over the course of the war. Ukraine's Air Force claiming 300 drones were sent into Ukraine. Now 250 of those were heading towards Ukraine's capital. They would have come in swarms over fields like where I am now in Kyiv's outskirts. Ukraine's air defense would have shot many of them down in places like where I am now before they headed into the city. Russia using a tactic of decoy drones to both confuse and to exhaust Ukraine's air defense. So while at first you could have heard many of them being shot out of the sky, after several hours you did begin to hear them hitting these targets. And all through the night, fires raging around the city. This morning you could see plumes of smoke rising into the horizon. The city of Kyiv telling residents to close their windows and to stay indoors. And you saw videos on social media of small pieces of shrapnel and metal caught up in these smoke plumes. Of course, all of this comes on the heels of this prisoner exchange that took place yesterday after it was initially delayed, where both Russia and Ukraine exchanging prisoners of war. And while both sides might seem further than ever from peace, or at least a ceasefire after last night's attacks, of course, for those families, both on the Russian and Ukrainian side, having their loved ones back home, of course, means the world to them, whether they be living or dead.
That was Audrey McAlpine reporting. Finally, to the China-Russia trade talks. A senior Chinese official says the country and the United States have agreed in principle on a framework for trade talks. Vice Commerce Minister Li Chenggang made the remarks after the first meeting of the China-US Economic and Trade Consultation System in London. The China International Trade Representative described their exchanges over the past 2 days as professional and candid. He also expressed a hope that the progress made at the London meeting will be conducive to strengthening bilateral trust and further promote the steady and healthy development of bilateral economic and trade ties. The US also said it reached a framework with China to implement the consensus reached by the presidents of the two countries. Ray Addison has more from London.
They have reached a framework for an agreement on trade, which will be taken back now to the respective presidents and for their approval, they hope, after hours and hours of negotiations here in London. First up to speak was China's chief trade negotiator Li Chenggang. He made a brief statement. He said that the two sides had reached that framework for an agreement on trade. He described it as a consensus on the Geneva meeting of around a month ago, and that now that will be taken back to President Xi. From the US side, will be taken back to President Trump. He described the communication during the negotiations here in London at Lancaster House as professional, rational, in-depth and candid. And he also said that he hoped that progress achieved here in London could be conducive for enhancing trust between China and the United States. He also said he hopes that it injects positive energy into world economic developments too. And of course, we have seen how very avidly the markets have been watching these negotiations taking place as well. Now, we heard from US Commerce Secretary Lutnick, who came out and made a similar statement alongside Ambassador Greer. They've been involved in these negotiations. And Secretary Lutnick saying that the framework of this agreement is based actually on the telephone call which took place last Thursday between President Trump and President Xi, that 1.5 to 2 hour long phone call which President Trump described as being very good. And he said that that call had really changed the likely outcome of the relationship between the two countries, so seemingly having a massively significant impact. And of course, then we saw within 4 days those talks, those negotiations arranged right here in London at very short notice. And Secretary Lutnick, confirming that once the presidents have approved the framework, he said, we will seek to implement it as soon as they possibly could. He said they're moving as quickly as they can.
That was Ray Addison reporting. Recapping today's headlines. Clashes between protesters and law enforcement officers over immigration raids are continuing in Los Angeles. Austria is observing 3 days of national mourning following a school shooting in Graz. And the Russian Defense Ministry says the country's air defense systems have intercepted and destroyed over 100 Ukrainian drones. That's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to the Beijing Hour, a 1-hour podcast news magazine program. We welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Tianlu. Thank you for listening.